Welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and practical application of the social capital concept, and the association is now welcoming new members. In this session, we welcome Associate Professors Claudia Morsut and Christian Curran for a presentation and discussion about social capital, resilience and vulnerability in crisis management. Claudia is Associate Professor of Societal Security at the University of Stavanger in Norway, and she has a PhD in International Relations. Her main research interest revolves around EU governance in disaster risk management and civil protection. She was local coordinator of the H2020 project, Building European Communities Resilience and Social Capital, and another project for the European Observatory on Risk Management and Crisis Management Best Practices. She is a project leader in a national research project on climate change adaptation, and it's from risk governance to security strategies. She is also a member of the network of Transboundary Pandemic Crisis Governance, supported by the Nordic Research Council for Humanities and Social Sciences. Christian Curran is also joining us. He is an Associate Professor of Risk Management and Societal Safety in Norway as well. His main research interest is in the area of accident investigation and safety in complex socio-technical systems. He has participated as a researcher in a variety of different projects, such as the Building European Communities Resilience and Social Capital, and projects focused on traffic safety and human behaviour for the Norwegian Public Roads Administration. His publications have explored safety in the heavy goods transport sector and the use of ethnographic methodologies in safety studies. So we welcome both of you for this webinar and hand it over to you for the presentation.
Thank you. First of all, welcome all from us here in dark Stavanger, Norway. It's 8 p.m. here. And we would like, first of all, to thank Tristan for this opportunity to share with you our research on social capital. And of course, we want also to extend our thanks to the audience present today, and we have discovered that all the world is actually represented today. So we're very happy to share our research with all of you. What we want to do today is to present some research findings from the project that Tristan also has mentioned in the presentation of our bios, which is Builders. And we really wish, after the presentation, to have a fruitful discussion with you and hear a bit what you think about what we found in this project. So we are following this presentation. Let's see, it's not going down. Wait. Here you are. I have just to push a bit harder. So today we would like to tell you something about this Horizon 2020 Builders project, the context of this project. We would like to share with you how we, researchers inside this project, understood some of the concepts that we extensively use in our research. We are going to offer you some empirics, some cases that we study vis-a-vis these concepts. We are going to share with you some results, more in form of a reflection actually than proper, perhaps highly scientific academic results. And then we will just give you a brief conclusion, and we are looking forward for the Q&A. And we are two here because this work has been truly real cooperation between me and Christian. And we are going also to share the presentation. So I start first by giving you very shortly the context of this project called Building European Communities Resilience and Social Capital. This project was implemented thanks to a grant under Horizon 2020. For those of you who are not familiar, this is the biggest European Union program for research and innovation. And this project lasted 3 years. We started to work together with 17 partners spread in 10 countries in May 2019. And we finished our research journey this year in April 2022. The partners were a very good very balanced mix between research institutions, universities, and private and public research institutes, and stakeholders. And for stakeholders, we mean mainly those who are working on the field. And I can mention civil protections, Red Cross, but also associations that work with vulnerable people. These 5 bullet points show you a bit the overview or the context of our project, a bit from where we started our research. Builders, in a way, argue that individual and collective behavior in disaster and crisis is only one of the aspects of societal resilience. We need also to take into consideration social capital. And in Builders, we also argue very much that, in our view, the most vulnerable people's resilience was not studied in the way we wish through this project. And the project had also a very strong focus on technologies and how technologies can help to communicate during disasters, but also that can foster new vulnerabilities. So we study technologies both in a positive and in negative in their positive and negative outcomes, in ways that these technologies could strengthen social capital and resilience, but also actually cause damages. And then the context of this project was very much crisis and crisis management. And what we argue for was that when a crisis unfolds, we should consider resilience, vulnerability, social capital all together as relevant factors to study and analyze. And this figure is, in a nutshell, this project. We thought that a house was the best way to visualize the work we did in these 3 years. As you can see, we have some columns and a floor. These are the work packages, and Christian and I mainly work in work package 1, which was the work package that established a bit the theoretical approaches of this project. Whereas the roof represents our goals and the main research questions. And as you can see, social capital is a central concept in this roof. And we have, as you can see, a series of research questions that we sought to answer throughout these three years. Yes. And here we, before giving the floor to Christian, what we want to do here now is to give you an overview on the concepts we use mainly in the theoretical approaches, and how then we reach a common understanding inside the project. Please, Christian.
Thank you. Always happy to jump the gun and try to interrupt the other people. No, these are, I'm going to go through, and together with Claudia, some of the central concepts in the project. And as you see, crisis is always with us, and it's one of the binding concepts, as you will see later when we present the entire theoretical framework. But so all the concepts, social capital, vulnerability, resilience, they are viewed together with the concept of crisis, which is a situation, as you know, probably where there could be a slow onset, there could be a rapid onset of a crisis, and there would also be lack of information, and there would also be possibilities for social realignment, which has consequences, of course, for how you could think on how to build social capital in the event of a crisis. But in the literature, which is what we have based the theoretical framework on before we started to a bit test it or to take it together with the empirical findings later, what we see is that social capital, described as a socially constructed concept, it's often given a positive account in studies of social capital during disasters. Also, when a crisis or disaster unfolds and during the recovery phase, we see that mostly it is studied not so often when the crisis unfolds. It's more about building resilience over time, and you see that there are parallels here between the concept of crisis, maybe the concept of disasters, and the idea of that we could find some root causes and connect social capital to those causes. Being a social construction, we need to look for negative spillovers, and what we call the dark side of social capital, in which case injustices, discrimination, and stigmatization may be issues. And thus, the concept of intersectionality is sort of a sub-category of concepts that we have included in the project. So we see that the dark side of social capital, it needs to be scrutinized to consider how authorities can build bridges across groups and to authorities. Usually the unit of analysis here is from the literature on social capital in crises are mainly communities, neighborhoods, families, and households. So the individual in this theoretical world is not that often studied, and of course we have tried to mitigate that also in this project. We also see that vulnerable people, social capital, seems neglected by the scholarship, also as groups and as individuals. But let's jump to the next slide. And we will see that we have the concept also within the crisis, that of vulnerability, which is in Builders a very central concept. First and foremost, from the literature, we find that there are two types of, two narratives of vulnerability. One ontological, where you have an idea of an objective type of vulnerability because of a set of social categories or because of exposure to the hazardous elements of a crisis. And you can have a dynamic, more dynamic narrative of vulnerability, where you think on vulnerability as not explicitly connected to an individual, but that an individual can be vulnerable in one type of crisis and not be vulnerable in a different type of crisis. We see it here as in type disaster risk reduction studies, that there is a need to investigate root causes. But by trying to find root causes, of course, we meet this more ontological narrative of vulnerability. And we, an idea that we have wanted to explore and try to include in the theoretical framework of Builders is to have more complex analysis through a dynamic understanding of vulnerability. And therefore also we have the concept of intersectionality. When we look at root causes, there is also this idea that where are we supposed to study? Are we supposed to only look for root causes? Is that our job as crisis researchers or as disaster researchers? Or could we also focus on other elements such as transformative adaptation? That would be beyond a bit what we have looked at in this project. But when I return to one of the surveys we did later, I will bring that concept back to us. Yes, I think that's it. And also, when we look at crises, you could consider that some event happened. Some unwanted event that presents a form of danger, and we would have, as an individual, you would have a high exposure or no exposure to the hazard, and there could also be a crisis where the context is rapidly changing because of political events or because of mitigation effects, or there could be a context that's slowly changing. So this attempt at a three-dimensional model shows where we have been struggling actually while building our theoretical framework, because depending on the case that we're looking for, depending on the discussion at hand, we would be moving back and forth, up and down in this three-dimensional model. Are we talking about groups? Are they vulnerable because of their high exposure to the hazard? Would someone else be more or less exposed in a slowly changing context? I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm moving now to other two concepts in this project called Builders. We have, in a way, built our conceptual model, our theoretical approach, using four concepts. We have heard about two of them, and now I'm moving in presenting very briefly the other two, what we have called building blocks of our conceptual model that you will see later in the slides. So the third, let's say, concept in this project was resilience. And resilience was probably one of the most controversial concepts we explored together in the consortium. Perhaps you know that resilience has become very much a buzzword. There are so many approaches, so many ways to define resilience, and perhaps the most striking is to study resilience as an antonym of vulnerability. So if you're resilient, you are not vulnerable. If you are vulnerable, you are not resilient. But we tried a bit to, again, have a critical eye on this very linear correlation between the two concepts. And then we, by giving, as Christian has just mentioned, a dynamic perspective to vulnerability, we sought also to give a more critical and dynamic understanding of resilience. Looking at resilience more as a process of adaptation. And considering that perhaps being resilient and being vulnerability is not something that is mutually exclusive in an individual or in a group, but they can coexist. And then we explore a bit the politics of resilience. Being this a European Union project, we tried also to challenge a bit the what we have defined in our project, neoliberal tendencies here in Europe, that we think are emerging both at national but also at European Union level, where we argue that the burden, in a way, of becoming resilient seems to shift from the responsibility taken by the state to giving the tools and the instrument to the individuals, the groups, the community, to build their own resilience, to the community itself. So giving this responsibility only to the community or to the individual, not without, let's say, having a drive in the state or in the region or anyhow in the political realm. So we tried a bit to challenge this what we have called again a neoliberal neoliberal tendencies, especially in Europe. And then we have worked quite a lot with this last building block, which is risk awareness. We concluded that there is no formal definition of the concept of risk awareness, and we thought that perhaps the best way was to explore this concept from an empirical viewpoint. We posit in this project that risk awareness is actually not the same thing or phenomenon as risk perception, which is perhaps a more popular and more used concept. And we also argue for more studies that investigate the correlations between risk awareness and as a social phenomenon that needs to be actually separated from risk perception, which is more based on individual judgment. Whereas in our project, we sought to promote the idea that risk awareness is more a collective kind of behavior. And then we also concluded in our project that several studies show the correlation between risk awareness and risk and social capital. There are a lot of influences there that we deem have not been fully explored, and we tried actually to promote a bit an agenda in exploring these correlations. And then, of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this project was very much into the use of technology in crisis management. So we thought that risk communication, crisis communication are very important issues to explore under the umbrella of risk awareness, because they can affect risk awareness, and especially the use of social media in the last years. And so we thought that there is the need to study better triggers of communication-related vulnerability to crisis and disasters, to better connect then vulnerability with resilience, with risk awareness, and of course with social capital. And then, so this was, I hope you have followed a bit the process we went through this project. This slide show you in a very short and perhaps very synthetic way a process that lasted more or less 1.5 years in our project, which was mainly consisting in studying the scholars who have used this concept and apply these concepts and study these concepts, and try a bit to argue with them and challenge their views. And then from this first process, we enter a second process where we tried to build our own understanding of these 4 building blocks. And this understanding was very much based also on a very iterative and simplified Delphi process that engage for quite a long time stakeholders. And again, for stakeholders, I mean those who really work on the field, crisis management managers, risk managers, but also civil protection officers, Red Cross employees, employees working in associations, NGOs that are dealing with vulnerable people. And unfortunately, we had to do all this. We went through a set of workshops, online workshops, and we have unfortunately to be very virtual because we did this through the COVID period. So we have to move everything on virtual platforms and work in that way. And we had a very interesting and lively interactions with about 22 stakeholders. And we tried to make a synthesis of what we understood together with them of these about these 4 concepts via these 4 definitions. And we are very much aware that these definitions are very much, they need to be very much understood in the context of our project, of Builders project. And we have absolutely no pretense to be exhaustive or to say these are the definitions, but we wanted more to trigger a reflection, especially with our stakeholders, about what this concept mean. And we also tried to some extent to make these concepts more understandable for them rather than for us academics, because we found out that several times we were not understanding each other. And perhaps this is a never-ending challenge, an issue when academics went out from or go out from their ivory tower and start to talk to people who are actually working with the real things, with the real stuff. And it's a bit the same experience we had. So these are our four definitions. And social capital is probably the definition that it's including a lot of the literature we read, and tries to include a bit the issue of networks, norms, values, and trusts. But again, we tried to contextualize this in a case of crisis and disasters. To vulnerability, we wanted again to give this idea of dynamic vulnerability. And we thought that for us is mainly the situation that leads to a person or to a group or to a community to be vulnerable in terms of challenges in accessing resources or means of protection. And then resilience, we wanted to describe resilience as a process, as a sort of adaptive process where individuals, communities need to adjust and adapt, in particular when they find themselves in a crisis situation. And then risk awareness, we thought to build a connection, a very strong connection with risk communication, again, due to this important part of the project that was dealing with the use of technologies and social media in crisis and disasters. And then from this, we contextualize, as I said, all this inside crisis management. And now Christian is going to say something on what is crisis management in this project, how we define it, and how we wanted to work with it.
We have based it on this model by Bjørn Ivar Kruke, where you can see, for those of you unfamiliar with crisis management, we have divided it into, well, three different phases, where you have a pre-crisis phase where the focus is prevention and preparedness, an acute crisis phase where there is a response, and then a post-crisis phase where the initial focus is recovery and learning, but then of course it all starts all over again, which is a model that was included in the final visualization of our builders theoretical framework, which is found on the next slide. Here you find the visualization of our theoretical framework. In the top, you can see the three phases: pre-crisis phase, acute crisis, and the post-crisis, which focuses on prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Claudia mentioned earlier, we use these definitions that we have found in or built in the Builders project. And even the idea of not making vulnerability a complete antonym from resilience, we still find that these two are used very much interchangeably in that vein, especially by people who work in crisis management. So when building a theoretical model based on the literature, but also in communication with real lived life and crisis response, recovery, and mitigation, we find that we're in a situation where some concepts, they can be, we know some things about them, how they are used, how they are conceived, and we've figured that that's why also we need to build this into our model. And we have a connection between this and social capital, where we also, from the literature, have found a very clear connection between vulnerability and resilience and social capital in the various crisis phases, and also on social capital's effect on risk awareness, your ability to be part of a network and understand what people are are telling you, and what is the awareness of the risks for the hazards in the communities. We did not find, in this project or from the empirics in this project, any clear connection between risk awareness affecting any form of social capital. If any of you have any thoughts on this, we would be very interested. And of course, this is the result of many workshops and many literature reviews, which you can find in the Builders deliverables and also in some of our publications. And as social scientists, we know that there are few tasks that are as exciting and as unthankful as trying to build a theoretical framework from scratch and have it also accepted within a consortium. As our Norwegian Prime Minister once said, everything affects everything, alt påvirker alt. We're trying to, of course, build it down, strip it down and try to see what are the linkages that can be tested. And as the Builders project is finished, we still do not have all the testing and all the exploration of this framework, but we might, of course, do so in the future. And of course, as when you remember the three-dimensional model I talked about earlier, where you have these different dimensions, and of course we have the dimension between the individual and the group, which is made more clear in the next visualization of this model, where of course you would have an individual social capital, you would maybe have individual risk awareness, and wherever you find yourself as a crisis unfolds, or as in different periods of crisis. And of course, many discussions we also had on, well, the crisis is over for the individual, but the crisis might not be over for the group. The crisis might not have passed for the society, because, as you know, we as people, we migrate, we move to different places, we enter new contexts, and sometimes we bring, of course, our networks, our ability to affect people for the positive or for the negative with us. Yes.
Yes. So when we reach a general agreement about our understanding of the concepts and how to visualize the connections among them through these two models that Christian has just presented, we sought to move on in our project by looking at the real world. And as Christian said, what we sought to do was a bit to test the assumptions within this model and our theoretical approach through these cases. These cases were all provided by our partners. In the first one from the German partner, and it was about floods, the Elbe flooding disasters in 3 different years. And then we had our Italian partners looking at earthquake. And then we wrote actually an article about the terrorist attack in Utøya, looking more at, in a quite critical way, at individual social capital. And then the Finnish partner established a sort of man-made scenario, a dangerous chemical explosion in a city center. And then we had a quite extensive and also challenging work via a survey that was carried by the Salvation Army in 13 European countries. And it was quite exhausting and challenging because, again, we did it during the worst period of the COVID-19. There were some countries in lockdown, some others were not. So it was a quite interesting research experience for us all to carry this kind of survey in such conditions, and even more challenging because the Salvation Army was in a way part of the survey. So some of us interview the members of this social care organization, but then the Salvation Army was also, the employees were our linkage with the most vulnerable group that has been studied in this project, which were homeless. So the clients, in a way, of this social care organization. And that also revealed quite a lot of ethical challenges in doing this kind of research by approaching this kind of population. So very briefly, we are going, Christian and now, just to give you some hints about this empirics that we use to test the builders model. This type of disaster occurred actually three times in Germany, and what we wanted to study was again to understand social capital and risk awareness and vulnerability and resilience in such a context. And the German partner mainly focused on shortages of healthcare services in these situations, and what happened especially to the most vulnerable people. And the method of analysis was also interviews, and mainly online interviews and online service, because again everything was run virtually due to the pandemic. And then the second of these cases was also very interesting, because the Italian partner chose to study 3 earthquakes in Italy happening in different moments. It's 2009, not so in Abruzzo, which is a central region in Italy, in Emilia-Romagna, which is also a central region in Italy, 2012. And then the central Italy earthquake in 2016 that involved three central regions in the country. And what the Italian partner wanted to study was to find out what it could have been done better, considering the housing accommodation, and how housing accommodations, momentary housing accommodation for those who couldn't go back to their homes, impacted social capital. And also to understand the importance of social capital when a community de facto is disintegrated, because in several occasions it was impossible to accommodate the local community in the same temporary housing. And what did that mean for the social capital that was built so far? And then Christian will briefly tell you about the next cases.
Yes, one of the cases was a terrorist attack in Norway. For those of you unfamiliar with this event, it happened in 2011, 22nd of July, where at the youth camp of the Norwegian Labour Party, which was on an island, an isolated island called Utøya. One individual dressed as a police officer got on land and started shooting. It was a major shooting event by a right-wing type extremist, and there were 554 children and youth age range 15 to 25, and some adults, and about 67 were killed, and 110 were injured, and about 50 of them severely so. The survivors of this event, they are quite protected research-wise, naturally, because it's a very special event, and because of all the ethical issues, of course. We relied mostly on research done by others, as interviews that's been gathered by the survivors, and also by different sources, and among them the media. One thing from this is that widespread use of different types of individual social capital, seeing that youth reached out very early to social media, alerting, of course, the Norwegian populace long before it started to be apparent in the media that this was happening. And also some of the linking type of capital where children or youth reached out to contacts and even to the managers of the crisis before even they had an understanding of what was happening, because the same terrorist had earlier that day managed to blow up a bomb near the government center in Oslo, Norway. So the focus was on the capital while things were escalating at Utøya. And also we had some scenario building as part of the project. One of them was based on, inspired really by real events. One of them was an explosion of highly flammable chemicals, where you had an explosion of residence and apartment buildings, and this was run as tabletop exercises by people involved in the different stages of crisis management. Here, of course, mostly the acute type. And trying to mitigate or trying to find the different types of vulnerable groups, which was a major issue in our project, as we, while trying to keep the idea of vulnerability as a dynamic concept, it's clearly also that some people and some characteristics of people are singled out in different types of crisis. And here we have people with cognitive disabilities, varying degrees of neuropsychiatric disorders, mental health problems, and resulting delusions, fears, mistrust, or irregular means of communication and channels. Yes. And then we have a survey that was performed during the project, where we had about 300 respondents. They were the clients of social care organizations. And the survey was carried out in 13 different European countries. And we had, of course, a lot of issues tied to the COVID-19. But then again, we did some studies also connecting this survey to the study of the COVID-19 pandemic itself, using various strategies, looking at the various strategies people used to make their situation more tolerable. We assumed, based on previous research, that the psychological impacts would be least negative for socially marginalized people living within their own homes, which was one of the categories, as they have better opportunities to protect themselves from infection, and they are considered, at least by the different organizations, by the world out there, as less marginalized than people who are homeless. Though these results do not support this hypothesis, so socially marginalized people living in their own homes reported significantly more negative impacts of the pandemic on their mental health and mental well-being than the other groups, while recommendations for vulnerability reduction of different social groups and in different countries. So when you are probably familiar with this concept of social capital understood as bonding, bridging, and linking. And we find that the three studied marginalized groups, people who were living in their own home, people who were living on the streets, and people who were living in assisted housing type situations, we found that the highest level among people living in their homes and lowest level among people living on the streets and in temporary shelters. Which again really just asks for more exploration. Yes. So returning to this concept of crisis management, we see that we have tried to use cases on the post-crisis phase, recovery, learning, as in telling case, a pre-crisis phase, with prevention and preparedness, looking among the survey, and of course our simulations, an acute crisis phase as an example of Utøya. Yes.
And now we want to share with you as I said, some findings of this research project more informed perhaps of reflections, and we tried, of course, to keep our focus on, for obvious reasons, on social capital. So here, what I and Christian have tried to do was to look a bit at the quantity and amount of research done inside this project and systematize a bit some findings within this pre-acute and post-crisis phases. And again, having a bit also a critical eye on social capital, because as we mentioned at the beginning, what we found very interesting in the scholarly research about social capital is this, generally speaking, of course, idea that social capital, having networks sharing the same norms, the same values, being trustworthy is most of the time a positive behavior in case of crisis. But we tried also to show that it's not always the case. Very shortly, we argued in this project that if an individual, a group, a local community bears a strong social capital, it's highly probable that before the crisis unfolds, it's highly probable that people, in a way, know how to behave and are quite responsive in the acute crisis phase. We argued that to be part of a network, to accept again the same norms, to trust each other is a very good, is a very positive behavior in, for example, understanding risk, being receptive in accepting information, sharing this information via social media, for example, and this can, on one side, strengthen resilience, but also have a say also in risk awareness. But on the other side, we also argue that strong social capital, if you have strong ties, if you trust, for example, only the closest in your network, this can also reinforce the status quo and can bring also to behaviors that are not positive when we go in the acute crisis. So in a way, the way we tried to resonate about social capital in the pre-crisis phase was meant to understand better than what happens when individuals, again, groups, local communities, what do they do when they find themselves in the actual crisis? And now, Christian, you are telling.
Yes, and considering social capital in the acute crisis phase, we see, of course, there is a positive impact on response. It on the group and on a societal level, access an informal security net that assists people to access resources and facilitates coordinated actions. But your network, your social capital as an individual is not necessarily the connections you need when a crisis or unexpected event happens. Of course, it's always good to be able to reach out. Maybe you will be able to get information, but you can get also the wrong type of information. You can get misleading or misinformation. Yes.
And then we move perhaps very fast towards the post-crisis phase. And also here we tried in our research within this project to underline a bit the positive and the negative aspects of social capital. We argue by looking especially at the cases in Italy and to some extent also in Germany, that there is a positive track towards recovery if it's possible to maintain these strong ties established in the pre-crisis phase within the networks And again, if there is this common understanding, and especially if people share the same understanding of risk and crisis. But then there is again this downside that we sought to underline, and that I have also mentioned in the case of the Italian earthquake. There were cases of members of the local community with fewer resources, with weak links to external assets already in the pre-crisis phase, and they paid in a way this this lack of resources throughout all the crisis, and also in the post-crisis phase in the recovery moment. And so we think that by looking at how social capital is built and constructive in the pre-crisis phase, it can give some important hints and understandings of what can happen during the acute and also during the post-crisis phase, during the recovery.
When returning to the builders model, we should always be critical to our models, and we should always consider them up for debate. Whether you consider this model where you have the combination of all these core concepts, and we've tried to use these cases to enlighten and to see if these linkages between these concepts are good and or valid. Whether you consider the model sort of a horn of plenty to start exploration, or a sort of a monstrous thing, that's up to you, but I hopefully more the former than the latter. What we think that we can find, if you move to the next slide, is that there are three main takes. That social capital and vulnerability share the same roots in societal circumstances. Strengthening social capital should be and is one way of tackling existing injustices provoked by power relations, and that we could also use more intersectional perspectives in studies on social capital, given the different levels explored earlier, and given that we have this very dynamic concept of vulnerability. So we end up with a positive take on social capital and the use of social capital and the building of social capital on these three different levels of individuals, group, and society. But we do also take one step back and consider that it's not always as easy as making a model that could be social capital. More social capital equals more resilience, equals more vulnerability, is a far too simplistic way of viewing this. And we find that when we talk to the people who do crisis management, that this resonates with them, which means, at least to us, that we are sort of on the right road, on the right path, at least.
Yes, so we would like just to conclude now our presentation by giving you, through the last three slides, some of the recommendations that we needed to provide to the European Commission when we ended this project. You find these recommendations in a more detailed format in the website, but we pick up the three referring to social capital. So we, in a way, we recommended the importance of mapping social support networks, and perhaps you all know how difficult it is in research to define what a network is. And this was also one of the challenges we had to endure in our project. So we sought to promote more research at local level on local networks, both official and unofficial, mainly operating within the local communities. And then we looked a bit on an upper level, at national level, and our recommendations were in a way were addressing the interesting finding within this survey with the clients of the Salvation Army. And we propose that there is a short term and a long term to address this kind of vulnerability. And again, of course, we sought to promote. This was again a research project, so we sought to ask the European Commission to promote more research in that vein, to again they understand the root causes of homelessness and poverty. And then we went on the highest level, which is the European Union in our case, and we ask the European Union to perhaps place even more emphasis on the use of the cohesion funding programs that are run by the degli region to build a local community cohesion. And because we thought that cohesion is yet another important component of building social capital. So we conclude our presentation of this project by giving you some, these are the publications that we have used to shape our presentation today. Although the project ended in April, the website is still up and running, so you can find, of course, more information there. And here you find our emails if you want to contact us, and a picture of the campus of the University of Stavanger in daylight, not in this dark day. This is how it is during, of course, when we are at work during daytime. So I, on behalf also of Christian, want to thank you all for being with us until the end of this presentation, and I give the floor to Tristan. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia and Christian. Very interesting presentation, and we've been very busy in the chat discussing a few different issues. So we'll run you through those and pose any questions that have been posted in the chat. For any participants, feel free to either raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, or you can post in the chat. And if you're not in a position to ask the question yourself, then just let me know in the chat, and I'd be quite happy to read it out on your behalf. So I think in the chat, one of the key questions that we've been discussing is whether or not the current conceptualizations of social capital are well suited to understanding what happens in disasters, and perhaps where any shortfalls are, and how we might conceptualize social capital to better understand what happens in disasters. And I'm certainly not expecting you to be able to answer this question right now, because this is a challenge that I think that everybody has. But where do you see the strengths and weaknesses of social capital, and perhaps do you have any ideas about how it could be changed to better understand disasters?
That's a question that requires perhaps a full evening. I think if I may start, Christian, and then you can continue. Let's say that these 3 years with this project, you can consider these 3 years with builders exactly this. We really made an attempt to understand better what social capital is in when disasters unfold. And perhaps I'm not sure that our presentation really pinpointed all the challenges that we met. But one of the challenges was for us how much social capital is, at least this is what we try to argue in the project. In our view, social capital is very much understudied, actually, in the disasters and crisis management context. We think that there is the need of more research, and also and research that takes into consideration all this crisis management cycle that we sought to simplify in pre-acute and post-crisis. Because one of the takes in this presentation and also in the project was that it's very important to understand the the starting point of social capital. And for us in the project, the starting point was what is the kind of social capital we have in normal times? How is our social capital? Which kind of networks, which kind of ties, which kind of values we share in normal times? And what happens to this social capital when a crisis unfolds? When we go into a non-normal situation, are these ties still strong? Are they strong enough to make us go through the crisis? Or is the crisis impacting in such a way that ties are lost and trust is gone? So I think this is my very short answer to this very complex and extremely interesting question. So thank you for the person who raised this question. Christian, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. Is social capital an apt concept to help us understand what happens during a disaster? A disaster that's a big concept, and that's perhaps why we mostly talk about the crisis and this division between three different phases of crisis, because that allows us to explore what's happening I think in more detail. In disaster risk reduction research, social capital is often fronted and touted as one way of mitigating problems, of working on this, on the different stages of the Dines pressure and release model. Often, I think, at least that's my concern, often ignoring that social capital is, in the end, mostly about connections and power. And you ignore that there is a lot of potential for marginalization in intersectionality perspective. When it comes to local and individual social capital in sort of a pre-crisis phase, I think there is some unexplored potentiality. Using an anecdote, I'm in the Norwegian Home Guard, and we do an exercise each year. And one of the things we do as sergeants and as lieutenants and so on, we ask ourselves, who do we know? And we ask our soldiers to ask themselves, who do you know? Who do you know who has access to X, Y, and Z? Or who do you know who are considered to be resourceful people? And that is maybe a way of thinking on that we should, maybe we should think on that there is a social capital that you use in a normal type situation, and there could be a social capital that you use in a crisis type situation. Sort of a crisis capital was one concept that we considered but did not raise, not in our publications and not in the publications, the other ones. And then, of course, you saw some publications from us, but of course there are many others because we are just a little part of a big consortium of people.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful way to think about it, because some of the research that I've been reading, particularly coming from Evangelos Tontis and his co-authors as well, look at the way in which disasters change things like trust and sense of social identity. And we might find that prior to a disaster, there's a lot of really polarized views, perhaps between different races or different religions or different genders. There might be views that aren't conducive to having high social capital. But when a disaster occurs, these kind of prejudices or preconceptions can be just completely discarded in the face of coming together for collective action. And so these ideas about, emergent communities and the ways in which all of these normal ways, and I say normal as in the popular ways of thinking about social capital as, networks, norms, trust, these kinds of ideas, it seems in disasters it's so highly dynamic that whatever existed before can be just completely changed in a blink of an eye in the face of a disaster. And so I guess the challenge for us is to think about, well, if those things aren't particularly effective at predicting what happens in a disaster because of how dynamic they are, then what are those things that are useful? to consider prior to the disaster. And so I think your idea about that sort of crisis capital perhaps is a different way of thinking about it that shifts the focus away from those things that are so highly dynamic to those things that are perhaps a little bit more stable and can endure through a disaster. So I think it's an interesting and fascinating line of questioning.
And if I can just follow up, thank you, Tristan, is that you could do this type of exercise or exploration on these three different levels. You would have a crisis capital for the individual that enables you to survive and thrive, and you would have a crisis capital for the group that helps the group thrive and survive, and you could have same for a type society level. And this is the big, and what you describe also is I think a big difference between a disaster, which is absolutely negative, but a crisis also implies an opportunity. And when you do have a rearrangement of the social space, as you described, then of course your capital, it becomes much harder to transact into economic capital. It becomes harder to transact into safety for yourself or stability for your group, I think.
Yeah, very fascinating. We're getting a lot of posts in the chat. I haven't had an opportunity to read them all. I'd like to go back a bit earlier on. Neil, you had some really interesting comments that you shared in the chat. Was there anything you wanted to expand on?
I can do.
Yeah, go ahead, Neil.
I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Professor Daniel Aldrich from Northeastern.
Yes.
I think he's started some really interesting stuff that looks at pre-existing social capital, not only in terms of the survival rates around response, but also, sorry, I'll just turn the look, but also recovery. And I'm particularly interested in your questions around cohesion. Colleagues at the University of Kent have done some similar work in terms of COVID responses in the UK and found that the areas where local government had invested in social cohesion programmes, they found higher levels of volunteering and higher levels of neighbourly help than other places in the UK. I also think it's the type of disaster that can affect the types of social capital. So I'm a practitioner more than I am an academic, although I dabble at both. And I supported the community after Grenfell Tower fire for 6 months. And there I think we saw a creation of bridging capital in the face of a common foe, which I think in this case was the government, particularly those that had refurbished the tower. Yet with COVID, I think what we saw was an increase in bonding capital, but a significant reduction in bridging capital. And I think it's that dynamic, isn't it, that just says, I think a disaster generally in its early stages promotes strong bonding and also bridging, because for me, a disaster is a problem that's bigger than all of us, but also it gives us an excuse to trespass across our social norms and boundaries. But unless that is supported and maintained and intentionally done in terms of bridging capital, I think what started as collaboration can quickly turn into competition. So for me, it's that interplay that I think you're touching on that is fascinating stuff. But yeah, generally just a big thank you. I think it's superb.
I want to thank you, Neil, because you have actually touched upon quite a lot of the issues that unfortunately, due to also the duration of the project, we were not able to deeply explore. As for Aldrich, actually, he was an incredible source of inspiration for us. He was probably the author that we read the most, because we think that he has a seldom critical eye towards social capital, that we didn't find a so sharp critique in other researchers. And the issue, yes, of social cohesion, as you have seen, one of the recommendations we gave to the union was to invest more in that. And it was, again, a concept that we just touched towards the end of the project. And we thought that's incredibly interesting and fascinating, and we should at least put it in one of our recommendations. And again, type of disaster, we had endless discussions, both internally here at the university, but also with the other partners. And we found extremely interesting to resonate around how, as you say, the type of the disaster impacts actually social capital. And we think that definitely there is massive potential for research to understand. And as you have seen, we choose actually by purpose cases and crises and disasters that were very much different. So the types of disasters and crises that we had in the empirics were there was one man-made, one natural, a scenario. It was exactly to try to grasp this kind of question, how the type of disaster influences our social capital. And we hope to have given you some glimpse here, but we know that it's a very complex matter that deserves probably much more research. Yes, so thank you for this, because you pinpointed issues on which we are totally agreeing with you, and we definitely would like to continue to explore these venues. Thank you.
There was also a couple of comments from Tim Little. You'd be welcome to share some more thoughts if you want, particularly around how can we prepare people and their communities to respond to their own crisis or disaster and help others. Because the observation that it's typically the neighbours, the friends, the family who respond to them much faster than any government agency or national level NGO can. So Tim, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. I mean, that's basically it. I work in emergency management, and in the United States, we tell people you have to prepare yourself to survive for 3 days before the federal government can get to you, can rescue. I mean, we have people that work in search and rescue, and whether it's like helicopter or search and rescue or like a collapsed building kind of thing, but we recommend most people, you might be on your own for 3 days. And, I'm just curious, how do we help prepare people? How do we help them to rely and trust? How do we build social capital for local people, to prevent the loss of life and property?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Timothy. How do we solve? How do we make people safe during a crisis? Well, you could always try and invest if you're thinking with these 3 different levels. You could try, and you're asking for the local, and of course for the individual. In the end, to prepare the individual is extremely difficult, and maybe not something that crisis managers should focus very much on, but focus on existing networks. And on, of course, resourceful people, the people who have a lot of social capital in already existing local organizations and institutions. I don't know, Claudia.
Yeah, that question, Timothy, was a question that was raised actually by all the practitioners we addressed during our research. And we discussed a lot actually about the role of first responders, and one of the conclusions of some of our stakeholders involved in the framing of this of the definitions we sought to give to the building blocks of the builders model was exactly what you are mentioning, that they said to us, you are the first responders. So you have to help yourself to some extent to help us to ease the situation during a crisis. And as Christian has mentioned, one of the things we discussed with them was actually this network building. And this is why we also mentioned that there is more need of research on what is network, what is networking, what does it mean to build a network, again, in normal times, that then can foster the proper answer when a crisis unfold. And again, I want to thank you because you are raising huge questions, and we would like to talk to you for hours. But there are definitely questions that we're bringing with us in our own research, and try to explore better these linkages. One of the issues also that we discussed during the project to better prepare people was also the issue of risk awareness, and the need to understand how people understand risks. What is their approach to risks? And here we think that the state and authorities can do quite a lot. We studied in one of the work packages, for example, risk awareness campaigns in different countries of the consortium, in seeking to understand how the national authorities are approaching the issue of preparedness, what they are saying to people in order to be prepared for an event. And here I have to say we found both positive, but perhaps mostly negative issues. And several stakeholders told us actually that they were not so happy about these campaigns because they thought that they were too much dismissing a bit that crises are different, disasters are different, people are different. They were too homogeneous in their way to address preparedness. So perhaps one way to go is to think that societies are not homogeneous. The people living in a local community are not the same, and try perhaps to shape risk awareness campaigns, for example, to prepare people, not considering more the individual level, who you are, which kind of, again, networks and assets you have to respond then when the crisis unfolds. Thank you for this, Timothy. It was a very interesting question.
Also mentioned, there's also the concept of cultural competency of crisis managers and of the state, and able to communicate to networks who might be who do not want to receive information from or skeptical to information from the state or from the municipality, while still being perhaps some of the networks who are clearly very bonded in their social capital and very cohesive. Yes.
Yeah. So there's a next question is from Coleman Rogers, and then we'll move on to Jeff Donaldson after that. Coleman had to step away, but they were interested if the topic of mutual aid and community established preparedness and response plans could be discussed as a means to mobilize the built social capital within networks. FEMA in the United States uses the concept of community response teams as a combined state plus community response to crisis. But this lacks mutual motivation in its initial phase and isn't necessarily an activation of social capital as a means to an end. So Coleman was interested in this being discussed, or if you had any thoughts on this.
I think that what Cormac is saying in his comment is very, very well and very much linked to the question that Timothy raised earlier. We were not aware about this definition of community response team, but is again something that that was expressed perhaps with other wording by some of the stakeholders we met in our research. How to establish again ties and networks where perhaps these are non-existent where there is a high probability that the crisis unfold. And this is yet another issue that we, in our project, by zooming in at the individual level of resources and assets and ties and networks, think is worth exploring better in research. I don't know, Christian, if you have something.
Absolutely. The question of community resilience, community activation, use of social capital to give aid to the local community was something that was discussed a lot. And of course, we would like to have ways of controlling, or at least using this in or have this activated in a set way that the crisis managers and crisis responders are able to utilize in a safe way without risking themselves and of course risking the community. And we discussed different ways of doing this, especially using social media and so on. And I wish I had some good answers, and for this I do not. But if something happens, the people who are most likely to help you are the people standing right next to you, or they are your neighbors. So we know there is a potential that's often used. Are we able to activate this potential in a better way? That would be should be focus for research, I think.
And this issue of a community response team seems to be a very common approach that governments take, is to create a structure. And perhaps this goes all the way back to the World Bank's approach to social capital in the 1990s and early 2000s, where there was an assumption that if you create a social grouping or some sort of a social structure, that it would then have social capital, and it would be beneficial. It would be used when needed. But we know there's a lot of assumptions that are baked into that, because not all structures we create are effective, and there's many other factors that feed into whether or not they are. And so just simply creating this community response team, I think, as Coleman identified, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be effective when it's needed.
Yeah.
So Jeff, do you want to unmute yourself and pose your question?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for presenting. And just, everybody needs to have their copy of Daniel Aldrich's work handy whenever you do disaster research. This is very timely, as this is in fact the subject of my PhD dissertation that I'm defending in December, entitled Social Capital in Emergency Management and Preparedness, especially the pre-phase context, as you contextualize it in your diagram, in the context of a COVID-19 pandemic. And I examine the existing social networks within the community groups within a municipal context that could be used by local emergency managers and leveraged in the times of emergency, and that how that relationship was built on trust or not trust through the use of various different methods of emergency preparedness, communications, all in the pre-event stage. So I spent the last couple of years knee deep in the research through which you speak. So I find this exceptionally motivating as I get ready for the defense, et cetera. But my question for you, though, is related specifically to, you spoke about linking social capital and the importance of it. When you did your examination within the EU, did you look at various different levels, like multi-level governance of linking social capital? My research is grounded solely in municipal relationships between the municipal governments and the local community groups, in ways that we can identify and leverage that social capital in times of an emergency. And I'm just wondering whether you centralized your research into a specific governance level, or did you look at all different governance levels?
Well, that's a nice question.
Yes.
Yeah, I think we didn't use explicitly, right, the multi-level governance approach. It was not so explicit in our research. But at the end of the day, we look at social capital from the local, mainly the community level, and the national level. We explore perhaps mostly these two levels, especially when we did the literature review. We had to make a choice. It was impossible, of course, due to time constraint, to look at all these levels of governance. So we chose by purpose to focus on the local level and the community level, and the group level. And also there we had endless discussions. What is a group, especially in view of the way we wanted to frame vulnerability as a more dynamic characteristic of individuals and people. Christian, I don't know if you want to add something about this multi-level governance issue.
Only that I'm sorry to disappoint you, Jeff, but there are other, in my understanding, there are other EU projects that have looked more closely on that connection, which was a bit beyond the scope of ours, though some of them might have touched upon it in the other cases, which would be in the other work packages of the project.
We should perhaps we should send you. We have these sister projects.
Yeah.
The project that were granted at the same time as builders, and we can send you the link if you like. I think there was at least one that was looking at social capital in this multi-level governance, with this multi-level governance approach. Again, it was not explicit. It was, as Christian says, a bit beyond the scope of the project. We have a totally different starting point when we started to look at social capital, due also the group was so, we belong to so many disciplines that we have unfortunately to mitigate or to neglect, even if I don't like this term, some important aspects to accommodate a bit and to find compromises where all the consortium could find their own way to study the same issue. But it's definitely an interesting. So you have this in your own PhD. You have this approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when the study that I did was looking exactly at that, but examining mostly what you speak about the relationship and the social capital building within the community groups, and then how can local municipal governments leverage that in times of crisis.
Good luck, by the way. It seems we really would like to read it when you have. So send it to us, the dissertation or some abstracts. I don't know. I think it's extremely interesting, this multi-level governance.
Absolutely.
Approach. Yes.
So we only have about 5 minutes left. So we'll hear from Neil next, and then Abraham, and I think we're just about out of time after that. But when we stop the recording, I'd invite anybody who's interested to stay behind and informally discuss what sort of takeaways there are from this, what sort of collaborative opportunities perhaps there are to engage further and make connections. Let's build some social capital, since that's exactly what we're talking about. So that'll about 5 more minutes, and then we'll stop the recording, and you're welcome to stay informally. So Neil, over to you.
Yeah, I'm just prompted by Jeff's PhD, and again, good luck. I'm wondering, we in the UK came up with a similar premise that community resilience is about how communities can support the work of Category 1 and Category 2 responders. So how the state can leverage the community support. I'm wondering if we've got that the wrong way round. I'm wondering if actually what we should be looking at is trying to support communities to leverage state support in ways that meet their needs. And I think having seen it in practice, but also having seen things in the literature, that I think is then a real challenge for the state in terms of how they support good linking. So I have seen likewise many people being displaced in ways that were different to how they lived before. One which is a flooding in the north of England, which I think was just a piece of genius. When they moved the community, and this was in dialogue with the community, they went for, we'll all go to hotel. The state was, we'll put you in nice hotels. The community said, we don't want that. We want to stay living next to each other. So they put up a temporary caravan park, but they designed the caravan park the same street layout as the town that was flooded. So everybody knew where everybody was. And they put local hubs in terms of the laundrette and other key functions there. So that sense of the social fabric or the lifescape was maintained. When I've seen that done in different places where people were dispersed to different hotels and there wasn't an intention to support them to maintain that connection, people did really badly. I also think there's something about state understanding that a community needs support to build bridges and maintain bridges across groups of differing need, otherwise it will destroy social capital. So many times I've been recruited into a patch where the government says, I need you, Neil, to find communities that we can engage with. And if we don't do it really carefully, they will pick the easiest and most appropriate, the easiest to find groups and the easiest to talk to groups. And by doing so, and without being attentive to potential competition about access to resource or access to power, they are destroying the bridging capital and creating competition instead of collaboration. So it's, yeah, I'm just wondering if there's a reframe in terms of our perspective somewhere here.
Absolutely, Neil. I think this is again something that you have expressed in perhaps in a very comprehensive way, and we have touched upon, again, this was a quite huge project, but we touch upon a bit also the issue of what the local community can actually offer to the crisis managers, those who come to help. And we discuss, and again, these projects open up so many research venues, but again, we have to keep the project within the framework that was granted by the Commission. We touch upon a bit the issue of local knowledge. That is a bit what you're saying, right? Is the who knows better than the local community living in that area? And I think that we touch upon this issue in one perhaps of the recommendations, but you put it in a very nice and comprehensive way. And I think again, what we have received from the audience this evening is giving us actually quite a lot of ideas that we can reflect upon and perhaps pursue further the research, even if this project is over.
Yeah, I have to agree, Claudia, and thank you, Neil. This is very surprisingly valuable, very interesting. It makes me happy because the things you allude to here is that given that we have a hypothesis of that there is an increased bonding capital on a local level between people, then of course we should see how could the bonding capital be used and to create and sort of help the communities to leverage the state for resources and needs, instead of creating that sort of reversed way of thinking on the bonding capital, where it becomes sort of in opposition to the state instead, which is perhaps the opposite of what you need, given the dynamics of the crisis. Because when we go from the acute phase, we will be entering the rebuilding phase. And what are we rebuilding then? So that's a great point. We should always try to reframe things and question our models. That's great.
Thank you.
So we're pretty well out of time, but I did say that Abraham could ask his question. Abraham, did you want to unmute and ask? This will be the final question.
Okay. Thank you very much. My question is actually on maybe the function of the government and maybe the social capital situation in that country, like when governments are more efficient, probably all those issues of crisis and others would be taken as a mandate, or maybe what has to be taken care by the authorities. So most often in many of the developed countries, there is no as such networks in at the community level, at between the individuals. So how is really dealing with this issue of social capital? In fact, I can say I'm referring to the networks between the people. I'm not referring to the values, like the way maybe it was presented as norms and trust issues. So in terms of networks, really, they're really the local institutions where people would come together and then engage in maybe taking care of crisis, preparing for disasters, management, and other like issues. So how was the experience during the data collection in the 30 European countries? That is what I want to ask.
You are touching again a key challenge we had when we approach the issue of social capital, especially in the cases we presented you, and also when we started with this survey, the issue of network. What is network? And perhaps one of the main takes in this project is that we agreed that this network can be many things, and we can have several ways to understand and approach network. But one of the things that we tried to understand in this project about networks was, for example, when we went into the survey looking at homeless people, we argue for these people had anyhow networks around them, and these networks were mainly established via the social workers. So this was the kind of networks, for example, that we sought to study and to understand, to see which kind of social capital these homeless people had. In the case of the Italian earthquake, for example, we discovered that especially for the case of the Central Italy earthquake in 2016, the networks were extremely strong, because this earthquake happened in small villages on the Apennines, where you have a very strong sense of community and belonging. And we discovered that actually, especially with the displacement of the survivors to this earthquake, this network was actually broken. Unfortunately, it didn't happen what Neil described. So if I have understood correctly your question, you were curious to understand which kind of networks we were looking into in the cases in Europe. And at community level, we didn't see so much how the various governments in the states where these cases were studied look upon these networks, because we were very much focused to understand the dynamics, social capital, networks, vulnerability, resilience, and risk awareness. I don't know, Christian, if you have anything to add about this issue. But thank you for this question.
Okay, thanks everyone. We're really over time, so we must end. Claudia and Christian, we really appreciate your time in preparing this. It's been a fascinating presentation, and from all the comments in the chat, it's been greatly appreciated and really beneficial for everybody involved. So thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you to you and to all the audience. It was very enjoyable evening for us to share these findings with you, and thank you also because we learn a lot from you, from your questions, and we really appreciate this. This was a very interesting exchange, intellectual exchange of knowledge and information and experiences. So thank you so much to everybody.
Great, thank you.